Maurice, and even the title, Camilla, Queen Consort, is something a lot of people really didn't think was.
At 8 o'clock on a rain-swept morning at Burke Hall, 3 red dispatch boxes quietly left the estate, carrying an emergency charter signed by King Charles that fundamentally rewrites Queen Camilla's statutory authority. The secret decree grants her unprecedented administrative power over crown revenues if the king is incapacitated, bypassing ordinary parliamentary debate. Prince William only discovered the move when his legal team audited land registry filings in Aberdeenshire. Now, a quiet constitutional standoff across the Scottish Highlands has officially begun. The Highland Charter, signed in absolute secrecy. A heavy brass key turned in the lock of the library door at Burke Hall on Tuesday morning. Inside, Dorothy, a senior archivist brought up from London, stacked 3 thick leather-bound folders beside a brass table lamp. Rain slapped against the tall glass windows overlooking the River Muick. King Charles sat at an oak desk, wearing a dark wool suit and holding a fountain pen filled with black ink. Beside him stood the Lord Advocate, Dorothy Bain, her official briefcase open on a leather chair. No reporters stood outside the main gates. No cameras were allowed on the estate grounds. The only witness from the public sector was a junior clerk holding a stamp from the Privy Council office. The paper on the desk was heavy parchment stamped with the seal of the Duchy of Lancaster. For 3 weeks, lawyers had worked on this text in a private basement office near Holyrood House. The document contained 3 pages of dense legal text written under an obscure statute from 1837. It officially created an emergency administrative charter. Under its terms, Queen Camilla receives immediate, direct oversight of specific royal private trusts if the sovereign is unable to perform public duties. The signature line at the bottom required 3 separate signatures. Charles signed first. The Lord Advocate signed second. The clerk applied the heavy red wax seal to the bottom of the 3rd page. The document was then slid into a moisture-proof leather envelope and locked inside the first dispatch box. Outside, a driver kept the engine running on an armored black vehicle parked near the rear kitchen entrance. By 9 in the morning, the car was driving south toward Aberdeen. Its destination was a secure vault controlled by the Scottish Land Registry. Nobody on the staff at Balmoral Castle was told about the contents of those boxes. The domestic team simply knew that state papers had arrived and departed under high security. The urgency behind this quiet signing came directly from medical reports delivered in late May. Doctors advised the king to reduce his weekly travel schedules and delegate specific administrative signatures to senior family members. Standard protocol would pass those tasks to the counselors of state. That group includes Prince William, Princess Anne, and Prince Edward. However, this new charter bypassed that traditional group for specific financial decisions. It named Camilla as the sole primary trustee for 2 private funds that handle land revenues in Yorkshire and Lancashire. These revenues generate millions of pounds each year. The legal mechanics behind this move rely on a forgotten clause buried in the Regency Act of 1937. That law allows the reigning monarch to appoint an administrative proxy for private crown property without needing a full vote in the House of Commons. The king's personal solicitors argued that private land management is separate from state business. They claimed the Queen needed immediate access to these funds to cover estate maintenance and staff salaries if a health emergency occurred. Parliamentary leaders in Westminster were not consulted before the pen touched the paper. The news did not leak through a press release or a royal spokesperson. It surfaced through a routine system update on a public government database. At 10 in the morning, an entry appeared on the official ledger of the Privy Council. The entry listed a statutory instrument under reference number 742. It noted that executive authority over the Balmoral Estate Trust had been updated by royal decree. To a casual reader, it looked like a standard property update. To land lawyers monitoring the database from an office in Edinburgh, it signaled a major shift in sovereign power. Within 2 hours, the document reached the Scottish Land Registry office in Aberdeen. A clerk named Alistair scanned the pages into the internal system as part of standard procedure. That was when the first red flag appeared. The registry system automatically flagged a conflict with an existing deed held by the Duchy of Cornwall. That deed had been filed in 2022 by William's legal team. It clearly stated that any structural change to Northern Crown properties required the written consent of the heir apparent. The clerk immediately paused the upload and contacted his supervisor. The system showed two conflicting legal claims on the same group of forestry estates near Ballater. One document gave absolute operational control to Camilla. The other document reserved final approval rights for William. The supervisor called the Crown Office in Edinburgh to ask for clarification. Within 20 minutes, a directive came back instructing the registry staff to seal the file and mark it as pending under executive review. This sudden consolidation of administrative authority raised immediate questions among senior civil servants in the Cabinet Office. A senior official sent an encrypted email to the permanent secretary asking if the Prime Minister had been briefed on the statutory change. The reply was short. The Prime Minister had received a courtesy notice 48 hours earlier, but the notice did not include the full text of the charter. Government lawyers began reviewing whether the king had the legal right to alter trust structures without parliamentary oversight. However, the quiet operation at Birkhall created an immediate tactical problem. In their rush to execute the charter before the king's upcoming medical treatments, the legal team missed a crucial cross-reference in the Duchy of Cornwall founding charter. That historical charter, established in 1337 by Edward III, contains a strict protection clause. It states that no asset linked to the sovereign's northern estates can be reassigned without the express written consent of the Prince of Wales. Down in Windsor, the news was about to break through a completely different channel. An estate manager working for the Duchy of Cornwall noticed an automated alert on his computer screen. The alert flagged a status change on 3 parcel numbers in Aberdeenshire. He printed out the notice and walked it across the courtyard to the office of William's private secretary. The document laid out the exact details of the emergency charter, signed at Birkhall earlier that morning. The paper showed the signature of the Lord Advocate and the official seal of the Privy Council. It listed Camilla as the sole surviving trustee with administrative powers over the land. The estate manager placed the printout on the desk and waited while the secretary read through the lines. The legal language was clear. A major Crown asset had been restructured without the knowledge of the Prince of Wales. The quiet operation in the Highlands was no longer a secret. What Prince William discovered at the Aberdeen Registry. A secure telephone rang on the ground floor of Adelaide Cottage at 4 o'clock that same afternoon. Prince William answered the call in his private study while sitting beside an oak bookshelf stacked with administrative files. His chief legal counsel, Sir Simon Case, was calling directly from an office building near Thames House. On the desk between them, electronically transmitted, was a 19-page PDF file sent over an encrypted server. The document contained the scanned pages of the registry hold placed earlier by the land officer in Aberdeenshire. The top margin of the 4th page bore the official stamp of the High Court of Session. It showed that title deed number 42 had been transferred into a secondary trust, managed by a board of 3 independent trustees. One trustee was a senior partner at a commercial law firm in Mayfair. Another was a private accountant linked to the Parker Bowles family trust. The 3rd trustee listed was Queen Camilla herself. The transfer granted this board full administrative powers to sell timber rights and lease agricultural parcels without prior review by the Duchy of Cornwall. William immediately requested a full comparative audit of all northern land boundaries filed since 2015. The legal team at Kensington Palace brought up the Master Register for Crown Holdings in Aberdeen. That database records every physical boundary line, mineral easement, and water right across the estate. A side-by-side analysis showed that 3 separate parcels surrounding the Abergeldy forestry block had been quietly reclassified under a commercial code in mid-June. The reclassification removed the strict conservation covenants put in place decades earlier. The financial stakes behind this boundary shift were substantial. Those specific forestry blocks generate over £4 million each year from sustainable timber harvesting and carbon offset credits. Under the original 1952 Sovereign Land Agreement, those revenues flowed directly into a maintenance account held for the heir apparent. The new filing redirected those funds into an offshore holding account registered under the Duchy of Lancaster Amendment Act. This change effectively cut the Prince of Wales out of the decision-making loop for that specific income stream. At 5 in the evening, William hosted an emergency video conference with his personal solicitors and 2 senior researchers from the House of Lords. The legal team highlighted an obscure section of the Crown Lands Act of 1927. That statute requires any modification of royal estate boundaries to receive formal approval from the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. The official record showed that the current chancellor had signed off on the transfer during a cabinet meeting in London 2 weeks prior. No notice had been sent to the Kensington Palace legal office. The meeting turned to the question of who actually drafted the amendments. Sir Simon presented an email chain retrieved from a public records request, submitted by an environmental group in Scotland. The messages showed direct communication between a senior land consultant in Inverness and a private equity firm based in Edinburgh. The consultant had requested an assessment of the commercial lease potential for the Ballater holdings. The email chain referenced a private memorandum sent from Clarence House in early April. That memorandum contained specific instructions to prepare the land titles for commercial leasing by the end of the current fiscal year. The goal was to build a private capital fund to support Camilla's personal charitable foundation after the current reign ends. The legal team noted that while the cause was legitimate, the method used to isolate the land titles circumvented standard royal estate protocols. The paper trail proved that planning for this restructuring had been underway for at least 4 months. The discovery created an immediate operational challenge for William. As the current Duke of Cornwall, he holds a statutory duty to protect the long-term capital assets of the estate for future generations. Allowing a sovereign decree to carve out specific northern parcels established a dangerous legal precedent. If the king could unilaterally reassign timber rights in Scotland, similar moves could be made against agricultural holdings in Devon or Cornwall. The stability of the entire hereditary estate system was suddenly on the line. At 6 o'clock, William instructed his legal team to file a formal caveat with the Registrar General of Scotland. A caveat is a legal notice that prevents any further registration of land titles without a formal hearing before a judge. The filing was prepared in Edinburgh and hand-delivered to the court clerk just before the office closed for the day. This action effectively froze all transactions involving the Abergeldy forestry blocks. The Highland charter signed at Birk Hall was now legally stalled in the Scottish court system. The filing of the legal caveat sent an immediate shockwave back to the administrative team at Balmoral Castle. Sir Clive Alderton received a notification from the court clerk at 6:30. He immediately requested an urgent meeting with the king to explain that the property transfers had been blocked by the heir apparent. The quiet administrative update had officially turned into a formal legal dispute between 2 generations of the royal family. The court in Edinburgh gave both parties 14 days to present their legal arguments. Before Charles could respond to the court filing, another piece of the puzzle surfaced from an unexpected source. An archivist working in the basement vaults of the National Records of Scotland uncovered a forgotten ledger entry from 1965. The ledger contained a signed covenant between Queen Elizabeth II and the Scottish government regarding the exact status of the Balmoral borderlands. The contents of that historic ledger would completely alter the legal battle between Clarence House and Kensington Palace. The £37 million revenue shift. A heavy steel door unlocked on the lower ground floor of 10 Downing Street at 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning. A Treasury clerk carried a black leather briefcase upstairs to the private office of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Inside the briefcase sat a 40-page audit report marked with a red urgency sticker. The document detailed a series of capital reallocations executed across the royal estate portfolio over the preceding 90 days. The total figure involved came to exactly £37 million. The paperwork traced a complex financial pathway starting at the Duchy of Lancaster headquarters near the Strand. In early March, 5 commercial properties in central London were placed into a newly formed asset management trust. The annual rental yields from these buildings, historically rolled into the General Sovereign Fund, were reassigned to a private equity firm in Mayfair. The legal paperwork named Tom Parker Bowles and his sister Laura Lopes as non-executive directors of the advisory board. Each director position carried a substantial annual stipend paid directly from the estate's commercial profits. The financial restructuring did not stop with commercial rents in the capital. The audit highlighted a series of rural land transactions executed in Lancashire during the autumn of 2023. Over 1,200 acres of prime tenant farmland were sold to a green energy developer specializing in wind farm installations. The proceeds from the sale, amounting to £14 million, were transferred to an offshore account held at a bank in Jersey. The account was listed under the direct administrative control of Camilla's personal wealth management team. Government accountants quickly identified a potential legal conflict with the Civil List Act of 1952. That historical legislation requires all revenue generated by Crown land to be declared annually to Parliament before any private distributions occur. By placing the properties into an independent management trust, the advisors at Clarence House had effectively bypassed the standard parliamentary reporting cycle. The move allowed the funds to be repurposed without triggering an immediate review by the Public Accounts Committee. At 9 in the morning, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury called an urgent briefing with the lead auditor. The central question focused on whether public tax allowances had been used to offset the costs of setting up these private trusts. The audit showed that over £800,000 in legal fees and administrative costs had been billed directly to the sovereign grant. That government allowance is strictly funded by British taxpayers to cover official royal duties, building maintenance, and staff payroll. The discovery created deep concern within the Treasury team. Using public funds to establish private commercial trusts for non-blood relatives of the monarch breaks long-standing constitutional guidelines. The lead auditor presented 3 internal bank transfers executed between January and April. Each transfer moved money from the official maintenance budget at Buckingham Palace into the setup account for the Mayfair advisory firm. The paper trail showed direct approval signatures from a senior financial controller based at Clarence House. The implications stretched far beyond simple accounting errors. If the National Audit Office launched a formal inquiry, the findings would force a public debate on the floor of the House of Commons. Political leaders would be required to question the legality of the setup fees and demand the immediate return of the spent funds. The Treasury team knew that a public scandal of this scale would severely damage public trust in the monarchy's financial transparency. By mid-morning, news of the Treasury audit reached the office of the Prime Minister. A senior advisor drafted a confidential memorandum warning that the government could not defend the £37 million asset transfer if questioned by opposition lawmakers. The memorandum recommended an immediate freeze on all pending land sales in Lancashire until a full legal review could take place. The draft was placed inside a secure red dispatch box and sent directly to Birkhall by military courier. While the government scrambled to assess the financial fallout, a second irregularity emerged from the land registry records in Devon. A 300-acre estate near Exeter, owned by the Crown since the reign of Henry VIII, had been listed as collateral for a private loan. The loan agreement was signed in February by a legal proxy representing the Queen's personal estate. The borrowed capital was slated for investment in a luxury hotel project in the West Indies. The use of historic Crown land as financial collateral represents an unprecedented departure from royal tradition. Under long-standing legal precedents, sovereign land cannot be mortgaged or pledged to secure private commercial debt. When land officers in Exeter flagged the mortgage deed, they discovered that the paperwork had been processed using a special statutory exemption granted under an old Emergency Defense Act from 1939. The discovery left Treasury officials searching for answers. The Emergency Act was designed exclusively to allow the government to acquire land for wartime national defense, not for private commercial investments. The legal team needed to know who had authorized the use of an obscure wartime law to bypass standard property checks. The search for the authorizing signature led straight to a forgotten administrative office tucked away inside St. James's Palace. Emergency cables between Downing Street and Balmoral. An encrypted desk phone chimed twice in the basement communications room of the Cabinet Office at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning. A duty officer typed a 7-digit access code into a wall panel and unlocked a steel cabinet housing a secure satellite link. On the other end of the line was the Sovereign's private secretary, speaking directly from his office at Balmoral. The call was not logged on the standard government switchboard. It was routed through an emergency military frequency established during the Cold War. The conversation focused on a 3-page diplomatic cable sent from the British Embassy in Paris late the previous evening. The cable contained information regarding a private meeting held at a hotel on the Champs-Élysées. Attending the meeting were 2 French financial consultants and an envoy representing the Duchy of Lancaster. The agenda centered on a proposal to sell long-term commercial lease options for 3 prime historic properties in central London. The potential buyers were a consortium of international private equity investors based in Geneva. The timing of this overseas negotiation created an immediate political crisis for the government. Under British constitutional law, any major foreign sale of Crown-linked property rights requires prior clearance from the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office. The diplomats in France only discovered the meeting when local authority officers requested background checks on the corporate entities involved. Neither the Prime Minister nor the Foreign Secretary had been informed that these historic city assets were actively being marketed abroad. At 11:30, the Prime Minister called an emergency gathering of the inner cabinet inside the pillared room. 6 senior ministers sat around a long table, reviewing copies of the intercepted cable. The cabinet legal advisor confirmed that if the foreign sales went through, the annual revenue would bypass standard British tax collection altogether. The money would be funneled directly through a series of offshore holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands. The political stakes were immense. Opposition leaders in Parliament were already preparing questions about royal expenditure for the upcoming Prime Minister's question session. If news broke that royal estate managers were quietly selling off lease rights to foreign investors in France, the public outcry would be uncontrollable. The government faced the prospect of having to defend an offshore commercial scheme it had never approved. The legal team pointed to a specific signature on the draft sales agreement attached to the diplomatic cable. The document was signed by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Vernon, a former military officer who currently serves as Comptroller of the Lord Chamberlain's office. His appointment to that post in 2024 was personally backed by Clarence House. His signature on the agreement indicated that senior officials inside the royal household were actively directing the foreign negotiations. To halt the transaction, the Prime Minister took an extraordinary step. He drafted an official letter invoking Section 5 of the Crown Estate Act of 1961. That specific statutory provision gives the sitting Prime Minister explicit veto power over any international land deal that threatens national financial interest or public policy. The letter was hand-signed in blue ink and placed inside a tamper-proof diplomatic pouch for immediate dispatch to Scotland. A RAF courier jet departed from RAF Northolt at 1 o'clock, heading straight for Aberdeen Airport. Upon landing, a police escort rushed the pouch across the Grampian Hills to the main gates of Balmoral Castle. The document was delivered directly to the king in the drawing room. The message was clear. The government would not permit the foreign lease sales to proceed, regardless of any internal household agreements signed at Birkhall. The sudden intervention by Downing Street forced an immediate halt to the overseas negotiations in Paris. The French financial consultants were informed by Secure Telex that the draft agreements were null and void under British statutory law. The prospective investors in Geneva abruptly withdrew their purchase offers by mid-afternoon. The immediate threat of an international property scandal was contained, but the political trust between the government and Clarence House was severely damaged. Yet, as government lawyers celebrated the cancellation of the French deal, a second encrypted message arrived from the Sovereign Archives at Holyrood House. A research clerk conducting a routine audit of historic royal warrants uncovered a sealed document dating back to 1973. The document contained a forgotten clause regarding the operational limits of non-blood consorts. The contents of that sealed warrant were about to give Princess Anne the exact leverage she needed to intervene. Princess Anne enters the standoff. A dark green helicopter touched down on the damp grass helipad at Gatcombe Park at 8 o'clock on Friday morning. Princess Anne stepped out of the aircraft carrying a thin manila folder fastened with a red rubber band. Inside was a copy of the 1973 royal warrant retrieved from the basement archives in Edinburgh. She boarded a waiting motorcade bound directly for St. James's Palace. No advance notice was sent to the press office. The historic document in her possession contained a specific amendment drafted during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. It addressed the strict operational boundaries of non-blood consorts regarding state property and crown assets. The text explicitly restricted any individual marrying into the royal family from holding primary administrative power over designated private trusts without the unanimous written consent of the royal family order. The signature of Prince Philip sat directly below the sovereign seal on page 4. By 10 in the morning, Anne convened a private meeting in the Friary courtroom. Joining her were Sir James Chalmers, the senior master of the household, and 2 constitutional lawyers representing the Privy Council. She placed the open folder in the center of the mahogany table. The legal advisors spent 20 minutes examining the precise language of the third clause. They confirmed that the warrant remained active and legally binding across all Crown territories. This revelation completely shifted the balance of power in the ongoing estate dispute. The Highland Charter signed earlier in the week at Burke Hall had granted executive proxy rights to Queen Camilla. However, because the charter was executed without consulting the broader family council, it directly violated the conditions of the 1973 warrant. Under constitutional law, a personal royal warrant signed by a previous monarch takes precedence over private trust modifications unless explicitly revoked by an act of Parliament. The tension escalated when Anne phoned Clarence House directly from the palace switchboard. She informed the King's senior private secretary that any further movement of revenues from the Abergeldy forestry blocks or the Lancashire agricultural lands would trigger an immediate formal challenge before the Privy Council. Such a challenge would require a public hearing. The internal family conflict would be laid bare before government officials and constitutional judges. The legal facts were unyielding. The 1973 warrant established that all major capital reallocations involving consort oversight must undergo an annual review by a standing committee of blood royals. That committee consists of the monarch, the heir apparent, and the Princess Royal. By attempting to bypass William and Anne, the legal architects behind the emergency charter had created an unconstitutional framework that could not survive judicial review. At noon, a confidential courier arrived at Kensington Palace with a summary of the meeting. Prince William reviewed the findings with his legal team. The discovery of the warrant gave him the exact leverage needed to demand a complete rollback of the secret estate transfers. He no longer needed to rely solely on the land registry caveat in Scotland. The combined weight of the Duchy of Cornwall founding charter and his mother-in-law's historic precedent sealed the argument. Facing an insurmountable legal wall, the household team at Balmoral was forced to retreat. At 2 in the afternoon, Sir Clive Alderton issued a brief internal memo to the land registries in Aberdeen and Exeter. The memo instructed officials to pause all pending trust reclassifications indefinitely. The £37 million revenue shift was halted in its tracks. The private equity arrangements in Geneva and Mayfair were officially dissolved before the close of business. The immediate crisis over the estate transfers appeared to be resolved. Anne's decisive intervention protected the long-standing statutory boundaries of the monarchy's private wealth. The estate holdings in Aberdeenshire remained securely tied to the traditional hereditary lines, preserving the financial integrity of the crown for the next generation. However, as the lawyers began drafting the final rescission papers, a clerk in the Lord Chamberlain's office noticed an unrecorded entry in the private ledgers of Adelaide Cottage. The ledger revealed that a secondary agreement involving mineral rights in Wales had been signed 3 months prior. That forgotten agreement held a clause that no one on the legal teams had anticipated: the secret Welsh mineral rights pact. A wooden cabinet opened in a subterranean file room beneath Caernarfon Castle at 9 in the morning on Saturday. A senior surveyor pulled out a brass-bound leather ledger dating back to 1981. Inside lay a forgotten codicil attached to the royal charter for the Duchy of Lancaster. The document bore a wax seal marked with the crest of the Principality of Wales. It governed subsurface extraction rights across 8,000 acres of the Cambrian Mountains. The surveyor laid the document under a desktop magnifying glass and began cross-referencing parcel numbers. The text laid out an explicit revenue sharing model between the reigning monarch and the local regional trust. Under the original terms, 70% of all slate and mineral licensing fees belonged to the local Welsh trust fund. However, a handwritten amendment added in April of 2025 modified that distribution. The amendment directed 60% of those extraction revenues straight into a private account held in Cardiff. That private account was not registered under the Duchy of Cornwall. The banking records listed a shell corporation managed by a former director of the Crown Estate Commissioners. The sole beneficiary named on the corporate charter was a private entity controlled by Laura Lopes. The yearly revenue generated from these slate quarries and green lithium exploration leases totaled nearly £6 million. The legal mechanics behind this quiet arrangement relied on an ancient prerogative right known as the bona vacantia. This legal rule grants the Crown ownership of all ownerless land and underground mineral veins in specific regions. By quietly reclassifying the Welsh quarry licenses under this legal doctrine, advisors at Clarence House avoided standard oversight by the Welsh Parliament and the Senedd. At 11 in the morning, an alert went off on a computer monitor inside the Welsh Revenue Authority. An analyst tracking corporate filings noticed a sudden transfer of mineral exploration rights near Blaenau Festiniog. The transaction moved 3 major slate extraction permits into an offshore holding firm registered in Guernsey. The filing lacked the mandatory signature of the sitting Prince of Wales. The discovery created immediate panic among constitutional experts in Cardiff. Under the Royal Charter of 1399, all mineral and land rights within the statutory boundaries of the Principality belong automatically to the heir apparent upon assuming the title. Transferring those rights without the explicit consent of the Prince of Wales violated 6 centuries of legal precedent. By 1 o'clock, William received a personal phone call from the First Minister of Wales. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. William confirmed that he had never seen the April Amendment and had never authorized the transfer of the extraction permits. He immediately dispatched his lead corporate attorney, Jonathan Jones, to examine the original register in Caernarfon. The attorney arrived at the castle by helicopter at 2:30. He spent an hour reviewing the physical pages alongside the local surveyor. He confirmed that the signature at the bottom of the April Amendment was a stamped facsimile rather than a hand-signed signature. The legal document had been executed using an automated office stamp managed by staff at St. James's Palace. This technical flaw rendered the entire mineral rights transfer legally invalid. Under British property law, any document reassigning real estate or resource licenses worth over £1 million requires an authentic wet ink signature from the title holder. Because William had never physically signed the paper, the Shell Corporation in Cardiff held no legal claim to the quarry revenues. By 4 in the afternoon, Jonathan Jones filed a summary judgment motion with the High Court of Justice in London. The court immediately issued an emergency injunction freezing all bank accounts associated with the Guernsey Holding Company. The £6 million in extraction fees were impounded, pending a full judicial review. The attempt to divert Welsh mineral revenues was completely shut down before the week ended. The legal resolution protected William's statutory control over the Welsh estate assets. The court order forced the cancellation of the April Amendment and restored the original revenue-sharing model with the local regional trust. The financial boundaries of the Principality of Wales were once again secure. However, as court clerks packaged the legal files in London, a senior researcher at the British Library stumbled across an uncatalogued diary from 1912. The personal notes belonged to a former private secretary of King George V. The entries described a secret financial ledger hidden inside a hidden wall safe at Sandringham House. That century-old ledger contained records of an undisclosed royal bank account in Zurich that remained active to this day. From secret Highland charters to frozen Welsh mineral funds, the battle for crown assets has exposed deep fractures behind palace walls. Every quiet move by Clarence House has met a swift legal counterstrike from Prince William and Princess Anne. But with that century-old Zurich ledger now surfacing at Sandringham House, the true depth of these hidden royal wealth networks is only beginning to come to light.